Well, perfect. Get this set up and then we'll dive on in. So today is an interactive presentation. And what I mean by that is I'm going to give each group one of the slides to present, and I'm going to sit back and watch and see how it goes. How's that sound? All right, let's do it. So I'm Audie Black. I'm a adult neuropsychologist here. I'm a proud Boise native. There's not many of us who get to say that. I'm just so grateful to be back in my home state and able to practice here. My wife and I combined were gone about 15 years, and we moved back in 2018 when we started having little kids, and we were like salmon returning home to spawn. And so we came back to be closer to our families. And Mary and I have been working together almost that whole time, actually, which has been just a load of fun. So thank you for entrusting me and letting me come into your sacred space. These programs here at the Healthy Living Center are so important, and I'm just really grateful to be here with all of you today. So we're going to talk about the neuropsychology of Parkinson's disease and Parkinson's plus syndromes. And the very first question I already had from Tony today is, can you define what neuropsychology is? So I told him, I'll try, but I can barely spell it. So we'll see how we can do. Neuropsychology, we are so trained in psychology first, and then it's several advanced years of additional training in what's called neuropsychology. Really, it's just understanding the relationship between the brain and our behaviors. And that includes thinking, behavioral, and emotional changes when something happens to the brain. So my specialty is working with people who have different kinds of neurological conditions. So as a result, I tend to work with people probably 50 and older, although now that I'm doing more in the work comp realm, we also get younger folks in who have had like traumatic brain injuries at work, that sort of thing. Does that make sense? So something bad happens to the brain, there's going to be changes. It's inevitable. And so we are tasked with assessing what are those changes in what areas, and then most importantly, what can we do to try to maximize function, and in certain conditions do what we call rehab, meaning let's get people back to where they were before something like a stroke. Does that make sense? So that's neuropsychology in a nutshell. I do comprehensive assessments. That's the bulk of what I do. And then I also do some targeted short-term psychotherapy with people with neurological conditions. And then I do some caregiver coaching as well. Yes, sir.
You do DBS baselining?
So DBS baselining, great question. For those of you who may not be fully aware, so if you're a surgical candidate for DBS implant, say with Dr. Martinez at St. Luke's or over at St. Al's, they often get a pre-surgical baseline for neuropsychological testing. And then they use that for a couple reasons. One, to do appropriateness for surgery, and then also to get that baseline so we can compare changes after DBS. I have done them quite a bit in the past. I don't currently, only because I'm not attached to a surgical center. With that said, more than happy to do them. It's just usually St. Al's and St. Luke's kind of does them in-house with their core team. And at St. Luke's, for instance, there's a couple neuropsychologists who were my old colleagues when I was there who are really fantastic at it, and they do a ton of them. So yeah, does that help?
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's get into it. So I'm just going to yak for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time just doing discussion. Mary, I may need your help. We'll see. Oh, never mind. We're good. Disclosure. So this is not a science-heavy talk, so I don't know if the top one applies, but these are my opinions. Feel free to disagree. I am the founder of Idaho Neuropsychology. That's our current group practice that we have. And any cases are de-identified. So this is a 4-part series as part of the grant that was done with the Parkinson's Foundation and the YMCA. And huge thanks to the YMCA and the Parkinson's Foundation for making this all possible. I'll go over some of our additional topics a little bit later. But as you can see, the main objectives are to try to understand kind of what are some of the common changes that we see with Parkinson's disease and Parkinson's plus syndrome disorders. Does everyone know the difference between those two? Should probably start there. Oh my gosh, let's do that. So Parkinson's disease is classic Parkinson's, okay? That's the disease that most commonly is characterized first by some motor symptoms, So when we start having difficulty with motor control, slower motor speed, etc., and that's what they're using DBS for. And then your classic medications like carbidopa, levodopa, these are all familiar, right? These are the classics. That's Parkinson's disease. There's a whole nother class of conditions named after the same guy, Parkinson, but do not necessarily respond to the same treatments. And there's some other changes going on in the brain. And those are more rare diseases, but we have things like MSA, multiple system atrophy, CBD, we have Lewy body pathology, etc. And we're going to talk in the third part of this series in a few months. We're going to focus on Lewy body disorder specifically, because depending on the statistics you look at, it's the second or third most common type of dementia in the US. So Alzheimer's is number one, and then we have Lewy body, and then vascular is up there as well. And so it's a specific type of Parkinson's plus disorder. The terminology is horrifically confusing. I wish someone else had discovered those other disorders because it would make it a lot easier to understand. So this is part of the confusion in the medical world when you go have your appointments and they say you have Parkinsonism. Has anyone ever heard that? Parkinsonism? And then, but they say, but you don't have Parkinson's disease. And you go, how long did you go to school? Because it sounds crazy, right? It turns out what they're saying is there's some symptoms that look like Parkinson's disease, but we don't think it's actually Parkinson's disease. And it matters because the medications are different, the treatments are different, the outcomes are different parts of the brain are involved. Does that make it clear as mud? Okay. So we're going to just try to gain some basic understanding with these conditions, okay? I am a huge believer that the first intervention we should always do in medicine is education, right? Super important. And then how do we thrive despite these conditions? That's what you're here for. How do we thrive? How do we make the most of life, even though something is happening in the brain that none of us would want? And then the very last talk in this series is going to be focused specifically on caregivers. Anyone is welcome, but just know we're going to be focusing on caregivers and how they can attend to their own health and well-being so that they can maximize their functioning. Because as I always tell my caregivers, you are the captain of the ship. And if you go down, the whole ship goes down, right? And so we've got to keep our caregivers strong. So that'll be the fourth topic in the series. But today specifically, we're going to tackle a few things. First, we're going to talk about some really common changes that happen in many cases of Parkinson's disease, even without Parkinson's dementia. Now, holy smokes, I just threw another term at you. We have Parkinson's disease, and then some people happen to develop a specific type of dementia related to Parkinson's disease called Parkinson's dementia. And then we have other things like Parkinson's plus syndromes, okay? So today we're going to talk about it, the common stuff, even without the dementia part of it. But there's some common changes that happen even without dementia. And then we're going to talk about how to adapt to these changes and thrive. And then we're going to spend the last talk or part of the talk today just doing in-depth discussion and Q&A. How's that sound? I have until the latest I can be here is like 3:45. So we have tons of time, okay? And after Mary kicks us out, because she's a taskmaster, we'll even talk out on the sidewalk if you like. I'm just teasing. Mary is like the nicest person I've ever met. So what are some common changes? You're going to think I've lost my mind to put up a slide with the brain on it. And please don't fall asleep. I know it's time for your naps, but hang in there with me, okay? I promise you, this will be the only sciencey thing we do today. I just think it's fascinating, right? This is why I became a neuropsychologist. One, I love helping people. That helps. Two, the brain is infinitely fascinating. It is the most complex organism known in the entire universe. Think about that for a second. Out of everything in the known universe, the human brain is the most complex thing we know. Isn't that staggering to think about? Pretty wild. We are just scratching the surface with our understanding of the brain. I want to be very clear about that. We know a ton. We're just getting started. It's amazing. But let me orient you to what's going on in the brain with Parkinson's disease specifically. Can we do that? All right, don't fall asleep. Or if you do, wake up in 3 minutes. Okay. This is called the coronal section of the brain. So if we're looking at your brain head on, okay, and we were to take a slice right here and cut the front part of the head off and remove it, this is what we're looking at. And won't bore you with all the details, but see the super wrinkly part on the outside? It's that really squiggly, wrinkly part. See how it's dark red? Normally, that's what we think of as the thinking parts of the brain. We call it the cortical part of the brain or the cortex. Anyone heard of the cortex before? Yeah, it's that wrinkly outer part. And it's super thin. It's like 2 to 3 millimeters. That's it. It's fascinating. The majority of the brain is this white stuff. We call it white matter. You've probably seen that when you get your MRIs or CAT scans done. They talk about white matter changes. That's what they're talking about. It's just the wiring. It's just wires connecting the different thinking parts together. That's all. So, any of you computer people? Oh my gosh. No one? A little bit? Okay. Let me think of a different analogy. Well, I'll use computers. Bear with me. If we had 2 computers, the computers do the thinking, right? And if we had a cord connecting the 2 computers so they could talk, that cord is not thinking. It's just sending a signal back and forth. Make sense? The thinking part, the computer part, is the dark red. The white part is the cords connecting the computers. Make sense? Cool. So with Parkinson's disease, the issue is this middle part of they call it the midbrain. It's really deep. And if your spinal cord comes up your neck and then it joins with the brain, right in here is a tiny slice of the brain that turns out is super, super important called the midbrain. And in the midbrain, there's some cells. And those cells produce a chemical called dopamine. How many of you have heard of dopamine before? Yeah. And your medications, carbidopa, levodopa, what are they boosting? Dopamine. These cells generate dopamine. And when they start dying, we don't get enough dopamine. Does that make sense? Turns out all sorts of things happen. This part in the middle of the white matter, see how it's kind of shaded some darker pink, darker red? This is what we call the basal ganglia. Have any of you heard your doctors talk about that? Yeah, this is what they're getting at. We call them deep structures because it's in the middle of the brain. What happens is this is the midbrain here. So this relates to this here, okay? The midbrain is connected to the basal ganglia in the big part of the brain. And that dopamine, it turns out, super important. So in a normal brain, we have nice, healthy connections. Notice how dark this area is. We get good, what we call projections from this part of the brain to that part of the brain. Everyone's happy. In Parkinson's disease, notice how light this is compared to this one. It literally, these cells start dying and we start losing dopamine. And as a result, the signals that are sent to the middle part of the brain, they weaken and we start losing that connection. Who cares? Well, it turns out this middle part of the brain, the basal ganglia, even though it's not the thinking part of the brain, notice it's kind of a big fat relay station in the middle of the brain between the thinking parts. Remember we talked about the wiring between computers? The basal ganglia is if we put like a hub in between 2 computers. So I have a computer, wires, and I put a hub that we connect into. That hub, when it gets messed up, guess what? We get changes in motor movements, in thinking, in behavior, and emotion. So it's not the thinking part of the brain, but it scrambles the signals in the brain. Does this make sense? Okay. Promise, that's the last science we'll do today.
So,
Yes, sir.
so what makes the connection between all this cord between the parts
Yep.
break up?
It's a great question. So there's in the brain, there's both functional changes, meaning the actual connections themselves start breaking, and then there's functional changes, meaning the chemical signaling in the brain is not happening correctly. Okay. So what happens is when we start losing these cells here, and it's amazing, we're talking a very, very small part of the brain. When we start losing these cells, and this is called the substantia nigra, That's the black part. When we start losing those cells and dopamine drops, all of a sudden the wiring doesn't get the signals it's used to. And in the brain, our brain is not static. It's changing every day. Think about that. Right now, listening to me talk, your brain is changing. Isn't that cool? But if all of a sudden we take away something it needs and it's used to, the brain is going to start changing and it's going to start rewiring and cutting back on the wires. So the brain, if you don't use something, it starts losing it. Does that make sense? So it's a functional and structural issue with Parkinson's. Okay? These are great questions. So we've already established there's changes in the brain with Parkinson's disease, right? Well, of course, there's going to be some thinking changes, some behavioral and emotional changes. There have to be. The brain controls virtually everything we do as a human being. So if you change the brain, you're going to change thinking. Does that make sense? And I say this, I know that's such a simple fact, but the reason I say that is because people are often shocked that, well, why, just because I have this disease, why am I having these other thinking changes? And I say, well, of course you're having thinking changes. Your brain has changed. It's a brain disease, so we're going to have changes in thinking. And this is our first intervention. I want to validate what you're experiencing. It's normal. It's a normal response to an abnormal situation. Something is abnormal in the brain, so of course we expect there to be changes. Does that make sense?
So in your regular brain, is there changes going on also as well?
All the time.
Okay, so
Your brain is never the same from one day to the next. This is what's so fascinating.
my wife would look at that.
You're what?
My wife would tell me that.
Yeah, our brains are never the same. And so it's actually amazing. From the day we're conceived to the day we die, our brain is changing every day. Your brain is not the same today as it was yesterday, and it's not the same as it'll be tomorrow. This is amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And this is why when we do our testing and when they do other kinds of testing of the brain, you get different results depending on what day you do it, because you're literally not the same person. Isn't that wild? It's so wild. This stuff's great. All right. So what are some common changes in thinking? Well, first, it is normal to have changes in thinking. We call it cognition with Parkinson's disease. And remember, we are not talking about dementia today. That's our next talk. This is regular Parkinson's disease without dementia. We're still going to have some thinking changes. What we most commonly see when we do our neuropsychological testing is that we have what's called mild cognitive impairment, otherwise known as MCI. Who's heard of mild cognitive impairment or MCI? About a third of you. Let me define that. There's normal changes in thinking everyone in the world is going to have, even if there's nothing going on. Just by getting older, we're going to think differently, just by being older, okay? We're going to think a little slower. We're going to have some memory lapses, etc. Mild cognitive impairment is when there's thinking changes that are more than normal, but not to the point of a dementia. So it's more than normal. This is not just normal aging. There's something extra going on, but not to the point of full dementia. Does this make sense? And we call it MCI, mild cognitive impairment. Mild cognitive impairment is very common in Parkinson's disease because the brain is changing. And some of the areas that are affected are attention. And I call this complex attentional control. That's a fancy way of saying it, because our attention is really complex. But with Parkinson's disease, we often have trouble focusing or concentrating as well as we used to. And we might be more distractible. We might have a harder time kind of shifting from one thing to the next thing. So I'm watching TV, I'm locked in, and now my spouse is talking to me and wants to talk about dinner plans. I might have a hard time shifting from TV to what my spouse is saying. That could be a harder shift just because of the changes going on. Does this make sense? Okay. So attention is often affected. Processing speed is affected. What do we mean by processing speed? That's how fast we think. So one of the common things people with Parkinson's disease will tell me that's so dang frustrating is I can do the work, I can think about it, but it's exhausting and it takes me a long time. Anyone resonate with that? So frustrating. Remember we talked about the basal ganglia as kind of a relay station? When that relay station isn't working as well, the signals we'll get from this part of the brain to this part of the brain just takes way longer. And it takes more energy, way more energy. So fatigue is going to go up, right? Processing speed in Parkinson's disease does this. It's hugely variable. Why? Well, part of it is medications. How many of you who have been on your dopamine meds, like carbidopa, levodopa, you start to feel it wear off and you feel like you're crawling through mud because your thinking slows way down. Anyone have that experience? Yeah. And it can be pretty profound when it happens, where people are, I'm good, I'm feeling great. And then all of a sudden, woof, I'm going into an off time. And all of a sudden thinking slows way down, confusion goes up, harder to talk clearly. That's because we don't have enough dopamine, right? And it's also affected by things like sleep, mood, which we'll talk about in a minute. Next, we have memory. And again, these are normal changes. I want to validate this is normal. We have things like short-term memory lapses or trouble recalling things on demand. And again, this can be part of normal aging, but with Parkinson's disease, it tends to happen more frequently. So how frustrating is it when you're having a conversation with a friend and you're trying to remember another friend's name and you're like, I can picture them. I know what we did the last 5 times we got together. They're a dear friend, by the way. And you're like, oh, what's their name? You're like, you're like, so frustrating. But the thing is, that's part of this process because that relay station that we talked about, it helps with learning and memory. And the memory signals aren't traveling as easily as they used to or as quickly as they used to. Make sense? Okay.
Yeah, does that happen because like I said, the wiring breaks down? Does it have to basically rewire?
Yeah. Well, here's what's fascinating. Great question, Tony. The question was essentially, why is this happening? Is it because the brain is rewiring? To some degree, yes, it's rewiring, but memory is fascinating. Memory involves activating I'm going to simplify, all the original parts of the brain that were activated in the original memory at the original moment in time. And when we recall it, we're reactivating some of those same parts of memory. And so you're having communications to about 15 different computers, but they all relay through the basal ganglia. Does that make sense? And so it's not as much a rewiring, although that does happen a little bit. It's just the signal is so much slower. Yeah. So
Thank you.
yeah,
I have a question.
please.
Do you think some of these changes are due to oxygen in the blood and the brain?
The question is, are some of these changes due to oxygen levels in the brain? I have not seen any evidence that oxygen level is the main reason this is happening for Parkinson's specifically. Usually oxygen levels are maintaining at what we call a homeostasis. They're maintaining usually about 94, 95% and higher. Some people have issues, especially if there's autonomic disturbance. Autonomic is the natural parts of the body that work without you having to think about it. Breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, those absolutely can be affected in Parkinson's disease because we know the disease is throughout the whole body, not just the brain, right? But for most people, I don't think it's oxygen related for most people. Now, there may be specific circumstances, but is there a specific situation you're thinking of?
Well, I'm thinking about blood flow.
Mhm.
And, I don't know if the flow of blood to your brain is affected.
The question is the blood flow to the brain affected by Parkinson's? Not in a reliable systemic way for most people. Yeah. So not one of the main mechanisms that we think of, but it's a great question. Now, there's always unique circumstances. I'm working with someone right now who is having severe autonomic disturbance. So remember, autonomic is auto, meaning you don't have to think about it. The parts of the brain that control the body that you normally don't think about, all the normal stuff, digestion, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, temperature. This gentleman is having what we call autonomic storms, and it is so debilitating because those processes that normally work really well automatically are not. And there's times when they go haywire. And so heart rate spikes through the roof, blood pressure drops, they can faint. They stop processing food that they just ate for lunch because now the stomach isn't processing properly. Rapid breathing, etc. That's what we call an autonomic storm. And those will certainly cause some issues, depending on the severity and how long it goes on. But for most people, that's atypical. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. You guys have some phenomenal questions. Let me get through this last one on thinking changes, then we're going to shift gears. So executive functioning, this is another common one with Parkinson's disease. By the way, every time I talk to a Parkinson's group, I love it. Who has medication alerts on their phones? Good. But seriously, usually like 3 o'clock hits and it's just like, and so we'll pause, we'll take our medications, please do. Seriously, but I can always tell when it's a Parkinson's group, My Alzheimer's folks, they forget to set the alarm in the first place. That's terrible, terrible joke. Okay, that was awful. I'm going to have to repent or something later. Okay, executive functioning. This is another one that's super frustrating in Parkinson's. Think about executive functioning like the really complex thing our brain does, which is planning and organizing things. We're taking complex information and we're simplifying it in our minds. Imagine, let me make this concrete. You're planning a vacation. Sounds so lovely, doesn't it? Not when you're having executive functioning problems. It's the most stressful thing you can do because I got to choose my flights, my hotels, get the rental car, figure out where we're going to stay for, it's just like, and you're like, this is supposed to be fun. Aren't you having fun yet? So executive functioning can often be interrupted with Parkinson's disease, and it really is maddening. And I work with, just because of the type of practice we have, I tend to work with like really high achieving professionals who used to own their own businesses. They were attorneys, physicians, CPAs, like people who use their brain for a living. And this is the one that drives them bonkers, totally bonkers. That makes sense? All right. So we've talked about some of the thinking changes. There's also some behavioral things that are going to change. And again, this is to be expected. This is not surprising. Okay. So I'm just going to focus on 3. The first one, let's talk about social isolation. One of the things that can happen with any type of chronic disease like Parkinson's disease, but specifically diseases that really are so taxing, is that we can start to become socially isolated. Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. One, we just don't feel good, right? But 2, it's a lot harder to travel places. Just coming here today is a huge effort for many of you in this room, right? Mm-hmm. It takes more time, more effort, more energy. You have to think about things like parking. And holy smokes, what if they don't have parking available right next to the building and I have to walk 3 blocks? That can be a game over event for a lot of people. So what happens is we stop trying to do some of those same things, but our worlds get smaller. Does this make sense? Mm-hmm. And it's so challenging. But there's also what happens if I'm having symptoms out in public. I was working with someone the other day, them and their spouse, and they were horrifically embarrassed by some symptoms that they had, including they actually had an accident while they were out. And this was someone who is like peak of their profession before they retired, used to even doing things like I do, like public speaking, that sort of thing. And all of a sudden, now just going out to dinner with friends is embarrassing, or it feels embarrassing. And so they're really struggling with social isolation because they don't want to have these things happen when they're in public. but their world is going like this. And guess what mood does? Goes down, right? But this is a really big deal. Sleep problems. You don't have to raise your hands, but if I were to take a poll of everyone in this room who has Parkinson's disease, I would estimate about 70% of you have some sleep issues. It's a big deal. We're having trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, and then we can get some specific things with Parkinson's disease. And not to pathologize it, but there's a specific type of disorder that often goes with Parkinson's disease called REM sleep behavior disorder. Anyone heard of that? REM sleep behavior disorder often predates the Parkinson's disease by up to 20 years. People can develop the sleep issues decades before they ever show any of the classic Parkinson's signs. It's often one of the very first signs that we see. And it can include things like really vivid dreams. Sometimes they can be terrifying. These are not always pleasant, but real as day. And we're normally paralyzed while we sleep, right? But with this disorder, you're no longer paralyzed. And so you start acting out the dreams because your brain doesn't know you're asleep. And so we start injuring our spouses, hurting ourselves, falling out of bed while we're asleep. We call it dream reenactment. And it's at a much higher frequency in Parkinson's related disorders than the common population. Okay. So sleep becomes a mess. Well, guess what? That affects how we feel the next day, right? It's a big deal. Some other common changes, and I want to validate this in case any of you have experienced it or any of you caregivers have seen your loved ones go through it. Hallucinations and delusions really can be quite alarming when they happen. And the Parkinson's diseases specifically, there's a much higher rate of complex visual hallucinations than even other types of neurological disorders. And so these can be things like, I'll never forget, one of the most vivid ones I ever heard. A guy told me, he goes, I'm sitting in my bed laying there, and he goes, it's like Jungle Book, the movie, like lions and tigers and animals are rushing into my room, pouncing onto the bed, high, vivid colors, like really just complex. And I was like, well, what was that like for you? Was that scary? And he goes, no, it was kind of fascinating, but I'm just sitting there and like these animals are pouncing on me, right? And that is a complex visual hallucination. I've had other people, trains moving through the house, but it was like clear as day. They could see all the passengers on the train, right? Does that make sense? So this is more common in Parkinson's related conditions. Can also be caused by some of the medications, by the way. When you increase dopamine in someone's brain, which remember the meds are designed to do, if you overshoot it and I give you too much dopamine, I can for sure cause you to hallucinate. Like you may need the meds to function. This is the catch-22. Does that make sense? We can also get things like delusions. Delusions are really strongly held beliefs despite the evidence against the belief. Strongly held beliefs even despite the evidence. So you can get delusions around things like jealousy, or people, they're out to get me. They're bugging my house. The government is tapping my phone. They're watching me. And there's no evidence for it, right? That's called a delusion, but they're very distressing. These are usually not pleasant experiences. And it's also really hard on the spouses, okay? And then an illusion, I want to highlight this one because this is also very common in Parkinson's disease. It's different than a hallucination. A hallucination is I see something that's not there. By the way, it can happen with any of your five senses. You could see things, that's the most common in Parkinson's, but I could hear things, I can smell things, I can taste things, or I can feel things. It's just the most common is visual with Parkinson's, but you can have any of the five. An illusion is something is there, it just looks different. I may see a cup on the floor, but it doesn't quite look like a cup. Maybe it looks a little different, or it might look like it's a bigger size or a smaller size. It's not looking quite like it actually is. It's not that I'm hallucinating the cup, it's that it looks different. Does that make sense? And we call those illusions. So if you're ever talking with your doctors, you can clarify the difference for them. All right. So we have thinking changes, we have behavioral changes, and the last area we're going to talk about are some common emotional changes. I'm just going to talk about two of them. These are the two most common emotional changes with Parkinson's disease and related conditions. The first is depression. The second is anxiety. These are really common, okay? About 50% of people with Parkinson's disease are going to have some depression, clinically significant depression. It's almost 50%. And about 40% will have some type of anxiety-related condition. Why? Well, there's really two main things we think about. The first is, remember there's changes in the brain that we talked about? And we also talked about the power of dopamine, that's that chemical. Well, guess what? It's related with both of these as well. So part of it is just because the brain's changing and the chemicals are different. The other thing is the kind of response to the changes. So we talked about social isolation, the world getting smaller. Well, if you can't go out and do the same things you love to do, there's going to be some depression with that for many people. That's a normal reaction. Does that make sense? If I mess up your sleep too bad, they've actually done horrific research on this before these things are made kind of illegal in the research read. But they've done things like horrifically sleep deprived people for a few days. Do you know how long it takes for someone to hallucinate and start having major mood problems if you sleep deprive them? We're talking like within like 48 hours. After like 72 hours of majorly disrupted sleep, you can have full-blown psychosis. Okay? Sleep is super important as human beings. And if we mess up the sleep, we're going to have a higher rate of depression and anxiety just from sleeping stuff. Does that make sense? So what I'm getting at with these emotional changes is what we call multifactorial. There's a bunch of things that are causing it. It's not a simple, oh, it's just this thing. And why am I telling you this? One of the most common complaints I hear from a loved one who comes in with someone, their spouse, let's say, is living with Parkinson's disease, or their parent, they'll say, oh, they're just depressed. If they would just get off the couch, everything will be fine. I'm like, way more complex than that, right? We're going to have some really challenging things that go into that depression, some of which are fixable, others are not. But it's not just the depression. And it's not just because they're not doing activity. Part of why they're not doing activity is all the things we're talking about. Yes, that contributes to depression, but depression also makes us less likely to do those activities. It's just a big storm. Okay? Yes, sir.
Would you lump apathy with depression, or is there a difference?
What's your name, sir? Oh boy, that's a good question. The question is, would I lump apathy in with depression, or is it something different? What a great question. I love talking about apathy. Apathy is a disorder of motivation. Apathy is a disorder of motivation. Apathy can happen for psychological reasons like depression. So anyone who's ever had depression in their life, I've had depression. When you have depression, you will feel apathetic. I don't feel like doing the things I normally like doing, right? So it can be psychological, but you know where I'm going with this. It absolutely can be neurological as well. There are conditions that change parts of the brain that will cause apathy, even though there is no depression. Think about that. So there are some certain types of strokes and brain injuries that there's profound apathy. But when you ask them, how's your mood? I'm fine. I'm good. And of course, all of you, because you're cynical, you're like, he's in denial. They're not in denial. They're not depressed, but they're profoundly apathetic. So that's a good example of neurological versus psychological. Does that make sense? Now, in Parkinson's disease, you can have both. So how do you know if someone's apathetic? I call it bump on the log syndrome. The person will sit in the chair all day and may not get out of that chair, and their spouse is infuriated. Don't you know there's all these things we need to do? Don't you see the dishes piling up at the sink? Don't you see blah, blah, blah? Don't you want to go do this? Here's the thing with apathy, the person may say, yeah, of course I see that. which just infuriates the spouse even more. And then we get into what's called spousal murder syndrome. Absolutely deadly.
Yeah.
So apathy, the person can tell you what they should do. They can even tell you how to do it. And what's most maddening, they know how to do it. But it's a disorder of motivation. It's difficulty starting the behavior. Does this make sense? So with apathy, if you can get the person out of the chair and literally get them out and get them started, they may be able to do the activity until they stop moving. And then you're probably going to have to restart them. So any of you car people? You are? I love this. What kind of cars do you like?
Well, just kind of depends.
Fast cars?
It's not the fast cars.
Expensive cars?
Expensive.
Expensive cars. Okay, I'll give you an expensive car analogy. Imagine you have a perfectly good engine. The engine's there. All the parts are there. You got fuel in the gas tank. You got oil, wherever oil goes. It's a perfectly good engine. But I take out the spark plugs. Is that engine going to turn over? Right? That's apathy. It's missing the spark plug that gets the engine roaring. Does this make sense?
Can
Okay.
you do anything?
Can you do anything with apathy? Yeah. The main thing you do is, and this is a hard one, the caregiver plays a role with apathy. The caregiver has to start the engine. The caregiver has to get the person out of the chair and get them started on the activity and realize whenever that person stops, they're probably going to have to be started again. Is it fair? No. But that's what we do with apathy. Now that's if it's a more moderate to severe apathy. With mild apathy, if the person realizes that's what they're dealing with, they might be able to generate enough energy to start some activities on their own. But I'm telling you, as soon as that apathy is even moderate, you've got to get some outside help. And there are some medications that help with apathy. Okay. Yes.
What if you feel like crying all the time when you're happy?
Feel like fighting all the time when you're happy?
Running.
Oh, it's like, wow. It's like take a box. Just kidding. If you feel like crying all the time, but you're happy. Okay. I don't want to diagnose. This is not a diagnosis session, but I'll introduce a concept that may or may not be related called pseudobulbar affect. Has anyone ever heard of that? PBA?
Yes.
Okay. Some people have. It's a neurological condition where you can have either an inappropriately strong response to a situation, or I can have an emotional reaction even though there was no reason for it. So let me explain both of those two. A pseudobulbar affect, PBA, I might see something that is kind of emotional. I use the Hallmark movie as the example. Anyone watch Hallmark movies? They're designed to make you cry, but you're tough, you're strong. But then Christmas comes around, you're watching it. If I have pseudobulbar affect, I might be bawling. And I've had people, tough guys, tell me, I don't know why I'm crying, sobbing. And it's like, yeah, you might have been sad before, but now we're devastated. Does this make sense? So it's an extremely strong emotional response. Same thing can happen with laughing, crying, anger. It's the intensity of the emotion is way out of context. But we can also have an emotional response even when there's nothing making us feel that way. I saw someone the other day with a traumatic brain injury who had pseudobulbar affect, brain injury, zero depression, zero any of those kind of mood things going on, and started laughing hysterically for no reason in the middle of the interview, and then couldn't stop. And it went on for like 25 minutes. Devastating. Former police officer got injured in the line of duty, severe traumatic brain injury, and is now profoundly disabled. Really sad. 25 minutes sitting there laughing hysterically. We cannot even interview because laughing so strongly, and he's like choking. He's like, no, nothing happened. And I'm like, I know nothing happened. It's okay. That's pseudobulbar affect. Does that make sense? So again, this is why this field is so fascinating, because things can happen to the brain that can cause really small issues or really big issues. And part of our job is help people understand what's going on. Does that make sense? So, okay. I do not want to simplify this. I also want to recognize I do not have Parkinson's disease that I know of. I do not want to be presumptuous. But I will tell you, from working with a lot of people over many years and based on the research, this is the heart of it, guys. How do we thrive and not just survive? I imagine many of you have been stuck in survival mode, and that's okay. That's normal, especially after a diagnosis, or maybe you've hit a rough patch where things got a lot worse before your meds were adjusted. I get it. But we want to thrive, not just survive, right? Well, what are some things we can do? First of all, and the point of this talk is to recognize some of this stuff is normal. So stop fighting against the fact that it's happening. It just is happening. Your brain is changing, and it's normal. It's a normal response to an abnormal situation. Okay? So give yourself some grace. Am I thinking a little differently? Yeah. Do I feel a little differently? You bet. Am I having a rough day? Absolutely. And that's normal. And I'm doing the best that I can. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So just expect that there's going to be changes. And the reason I say this, I work with a lot of people who they're so fixated and angry on the fact that things are changing, they can't move past it. Well, you know what? If you spend all your time angry and bitter about the fact that it's happening, you're going to spend all your time feeling angry and bitter. And I get it. That's grieving. That's normal too. But we got to move past that, right? It's happening. So it's normal. It's happening. And let's move on to some other things. Number 2, focus on what you can control. Can you control the fact that part of your brain is no longer sending dopamine to the right part of the other part of the brain and that you need medication? No. Can you control the fact that there's changes going on in your brain that affect how you think, feel, and act? No. But what can you control? Let's brainstorm. I put the most important one up there. I think attitude is the number one most important thing that we have some control over, right? This may be a really crappy situation. I certainly don't want this to be happening. I'm frankly angry it's happening, but I'm going to change how I think about it, right? I think that's the most important. But what are some other things you can control in your day? Let's just brainstorm for a second.
Choices.
Choices. Oh, I love it. Former psychologist? Okay. Therapist? Of course. You like how I guessed that? Of course, the therapist says you can control your choices. I love that. True.
What?
So the answer was choices.
What we eat.
What we eat, that's a choice. What we put in our body. Food is medicine, okay? What we put in our body has a tremendous impact on how we feel. And by the way, there's some really cool stuff with Parkinson's disease specifically about diet. Stay tuned. Have they had any of those yet?
We just had a class last week. We have 3 more to go.
Anyone go to that?
Yeah.
Actually, please go. The food we put into our body is our primary source of fuel. It makes a tremendous difference, and there are specific things with Parkinson's disease specifically that can really help. And diet is a big one. I love this. I love this. I love this. What else can we control? Schedule. Yes. And one of the things I work on with people with Parkinson's disease and some other conditions is what we call energy management. You guys know where I'm going with this? There's going to be times of the day when you naturally have more energy, and it's going to be a combination of sleep. It's going to be a combination of when you take your medicines and when they are working at their peak ability, but before I crash, right? Use those times very carefully. Those are your golden opportunities to do the things that matter most to you. But there's going to be other times, and it's usually later in the afternoon, in the evening, when most people are just kind of done for the day, and that's fine. Guess what we're not doing? We're not making major life decisions at 6 p.m. We're not deciding the major house renovation that we've been talking about for a few years, and I'm going to spend $300,000 on it. That is not a 6 p.m. decision. That's a 9 a.m. decision. When you're fueled up, you're rested, you've taken your meds, you might have had a cup of coffee, and hopefully you've taken a little walk. Does that make sense? We got to control our energy. So diet, energy. What are some other things you can control? Sleep is partially in control. You can do sleep hygiene, which is super important. We can talk a lot about that. Some of the sleep with Parkinson's is just going to be what it is. But absolutely, there's some big behavioral things you can do to optimize sleep, even if it's not perfect. Other things we can control?
Taking medication.
Taking medications and taking it on time when prescribed, right? Big one.
Nice.
Yes, big one, huge one. Meds, I spend a lot of time with people around the medication management. I don't prescribe any meds. I'm talking about the behavioral management around meds. It's a big one. It's a big one. Thank you for mentioning that. Last one.
Who you interact with?
Who you interact with. Yes. Life is too short to be with jerks, right? Choose to be around people who love you, support you, and who you feel better about. Now, we all have family. There are times some of our family may not make us feel great. Then be really conscious about when you spend time with those people, right? But we want to be mindful about who we're spending time with, because boy, it makes a difference, doesn't it? It makes a difference. I love these, love these, love these. If we have more time, we'll spend more time on that. Notice how many we came up with that you can control. And by the way, I can't believe none of you mentioned fashion, given how, I'm teasing. All I have are blue and purple in my closet. And that way, anything I put together looks halfway reasonable. I'm terrible at fashion, but there's all sorts of things we can control, right? All sorts of things. And boy, doesn't it feel better when we feel in control? Because what does Parkinson's disease make you feel out of control? Can't control my movements. I can't control my autonomic nervous system. My bowels are a mess. My sleep's now dysfunctional, right? It feels like nothing but a loss of control. But dang it, there's a ton you can control. What a great thing. Seize it. Get connected. You're here. I'm preaching to the choir on this one, but please talk to the people you know in your life who maybe are not connected and get them connected. Invite them to an event. Drag them if necessary. It is so important. And we know when we're educated, when we are in support groups, when we participate in programs like offered through the Healthy Living Center, delayed disease, movement for memory, those type of programs, what do we know? Not only does it help just with day-to-day functioning, but you actually help your brain function better. It's another medicine. When we're around people like this right here, guess what? Our brains are releasing chemicals they don't release when you're at home by yourself. How cool is that? There's serotonin. If I give you a hug, we're both going to get some oxytocin. Powerful chemical. Being around people we love and like and are connected to is medicine. Okay? So if you want to help your brain, get connected. Stay active. And again, preaching to the choir here. I love when I walked in, St. Mary was showing me around the grounds and showed me the exercise room. And there's a class going on. And I said, gosh, this is great. Working on balance, strength, social connection, cognitive activity, but we're staying active. Now, you may not want to do those type of programs. That's okay. Find what is something that you're interested in and do it. Okay? Today's the day. Do it. If it's photography, if it's painting, if it's woodworking, if it's storytelling, whatever it is, just be active. And we got to fight against that apathy. And this last one is the last point of this slide. Savor today. One of the things that happens with any chronic illness is we spend so much time worrying about tomorrow. I have a health condition that I'm dealing with. We got it under control, but man, when I got the diagnosis, super scary. And where did my mind go? To all the what ifs. What if, what if, what if, what if, oh my God, what's going to happen, right? That's normal, but not helpful to stay there. What we need to do is say, okay, am I taking care of the long-term stuff? Good. Now I'm going to focus on today and right now. and I'm going to savor these moments. And so practice good mindfulness. Just when you're drinking a cup of coffee, smell the coffee. Close your eyes, take a big breath in. Wow, what a phenomenal cup of coffee. I didn't even notice how good this smelled. Any of you ever had that experience? You're doing something and you're just on autopilot, and it's like the beauty just passed right in front of you. You know what I'm talking about? Savor the moment. It's full of things to savor. When you take that hug from your loved one, spend an extra second on it. Feel it. Soak it in, right? When you finally get the energy to go out with a couple close friends and you grab that dinner that you've been planning for 4 months and felt impossible, enjoy every second of it. Savor the moment. And we know it helps us navigate these diseases. So here are some resources. These are all hyperlinked. Mary will distribute the slides. Obviously, we have what I think is one of the great gems of our state, and that's right here in the Treasure Valley. That's the Healthy Living Center. These programs are phenomenal. I presume you're all connected, but if not, talk to Mary. Look at the website. Mary just shared this one with me related to someone else I was asking her about, but Dance for Parkinson's Idaho through Opera Foundation, or is it through ballet? I think ballet. That would make more sense. So, and then we have the ADRD Alliance through the Department of Health and Welfare. I know it says Alzheimer's in the title. I'm not trying to throw you for a loop. I'm not saying you have a condition you don't have. I'm saying our state, it's Idaho. We have very limited resources. All this stuff kind of gets lumped together, okay? But Tiffany is a phenomenal resource there and her team, and they're trying to connect people around the state. This one's probably a little bit higher level than might be practical day to day, but I just want to put up there so you know that that's going on. This one is, if any of you happen to know any medical providers who are physicians, PAs, NPs, social workers, therapists, etc. There is, and full disclosure, I'm one of the panelists on this series, but this year, the University of Idaho has a video podcast series that's done every single month designed to help educate our providers in Idaho about these kind of conditions. And it's awesome. We have up to 80 people on the call. Sometimes it's 30, 40, but it's designed for people all around the state, including our rural providers. And we have everyone from physicians to PAs to NPs to a ton of social workers join. We have pharmacists on the call, psychologists, like it's awesome. And so keep that in mind. It's a free series that's run. We have the Southwest Idaho Area Agency on Aging that can help with in-home resources, and you can reach out to them. And then we have for our caregivers, Aging Strong by Janice, their Powerful Tools for Caregivers program. Call Karen Karub over there, get plugged in and do their class. It's awesome. So where are we going? Well, we have for my series, and Mary has all the other dates. We have January 13th, March 10th, and May 12th. I know you all got this flyer probably, but here are the topics we're going to cover next. Next one will be focused specifically on Parkinson's dementia. So not the normal stuff, but when it progresses, if it progresses. After that, we're going to be talking about unique considerations with Lewy body dementia, which is that Parkinson's plus syndrome disorder we talked about. And then lastly, for the caregiver specifically. So let's have a discussion. How are we doing time-wise? We good? Oh, wow. I'm so sorry. Wow. Worst timing ever. Do we have time, Mary?
So why do we do?
Yeah.
We don't have to be out of here.
Cool.
If you need to leave,
Yeah.
you have somewhere to be, that's okay.
Yeah.
But
So,
if you want to stay and have questions,
you
you
bet.
can do it as a group format, or you can also do one-on-one.
And you will not offend me or anyone else if you need to get up and scoot out. Okay. So I know we did questions as we went, but I'm happy to stay and we can have a discussion for anyone who would like. Yes, sir.
I don't know what topic, mention a topic I was interested in. What is the cause of it? Do we have things like boxers get it? Do people farm chemicals? Are there a list of things that we may have got this?
Great question. So the question is, what's causing Parkinson's disease? And do we have a list of things? And the answer is yes. So we're increasingly understanding several things about Parkinson's. One, for many people, there's a strong genetic component. And the way to think about genes, okay,